Thank you. That was really nice. And I love the warning to the economist about how to behave. Yeah, but I'll say that if there are clarification questions, I'm also happy, I don't mind if you just want some clarification, because if you're confused about something, it's fine to make sure that everybody's on the same page rather than staying confused till the end. So relative to the last time I was here I was probably in the econ department giving a development economics seminar. Like the development economics field is like completely turned over. If I'd known, I would have maybe even presented an RCT, which I was scared to present the last time I was here. Okay, so I work on migration. So I only have a couple of papers on China. A lot of my migration work is more in South Asia and Southeast Asia. But that's the angle at which I'm coming to this paper, which is thinking about migration restrictions, which is sort of a unique policy in China, or hukou policy, and what effects and some unintended consequences that it has. And as you can tell from the names of the authors, my co-authors, Xu Wengao, Wenchuan Liang, and Han Song, that I'm not the China expert in this group. But I know in the audience there are many China experts. So like if there's clarification that's required, I'm also happy for somebody else to correct me when and tell the audience what I'm getting wrong. Okay, so I want to start by just giving you a little bit of an overview of the hukou system and the aspects of it that's going to be relevant for the research project today. Okay? So this is unlike many countries, and there are some chairs in the front if you want to come grab them. So unlike many countries, there's basically internal mobility restrictions. Okay? So each person is born with a hukou, so they're assigned a locality of registration. They get either a rural or an urban hukou, right? And that determines the person's eligibility for a lot of important things. Like, for example, to buy real estate in a city, you may need a local hukou to be allowed to buy real estate. And one of the things that's going to matter a lot for this paper is that access to state-provided goods and services, such as access to public education, healthcare, etc., could also be determined by your local hukou, right? So essentially, if you don't have if I'm living in a city, I don't have local hukou, it might be more costly for me to send my kids to school there, or access healthcare there, or access public services there. Okay? So that's what matters. Now, so therefore, like, why is this important? It's going to affect a lot of people, right? There are, in the 2005 census in China, there were 145 million rural to urban migrants. This has been a really important part of China's growth story in the last 30 years. Cities have been engines of growth. There's been massive in-migration into cities. And of those, the vast majority, 124 million, are unskilled migrants with rural hukou. And I say unskilled because when you have less skill, it is actually harder for you to get an urban hukou. So just like, say, Canada or Australia's point system for migration, right? Similarly, cities in China allow more skilled workers easier access to urban hukou. Okay. And so you have all these, it matters because there are millions of migrants and their access to the public services in the cities where they live is severely restricted, including access to kids' education. Okay. So notice that in what I just described, there's absolutely no gender dimension to this, right? It's not the case that the hukou system has any gendered restrictions, right? Either in its design or its intent. Okay. And in spite of that, of course, the paper is going to be about gender. Gender is in the title. We have to make that connection. Okay, so one of the consequences of these hukou restrictions and restricting access to public services for migrants is that now you have 69 million children who have been left behind in rural areas by their migrant parents. Okay? So this accounts for about a third of all children being born in rural areas are now growing up without at least a parent. Okay? And in fact, most of them are growing up without either parent present. So when there are urban migrants, it's typically the case that both parents are migrating and the child is left behind. And the most common case would be being left behind with a grandparent. Okay. So why is this policy relevant? This is a choice China is making. Okay. This is a direct result of hukou restrictions, and I'll make that connection for you today, right? And the policy explicitly is designed to make it more costly to bring children to cities with migrant parents. Okay? In some ways, it's getting worse over time. So post 2014, there was a new decree from the central government on a population control policy that made it even more difficult then to bring your children. Okay, and as a result, what you see is the blue line here is the population in urban areas. Right? That's not surprising. China has been urbanizing quite fast. The red line is the population in urban areas who have a local urban hukou. Okay, so that's also growing, but as you can see, the gap between those two lines is growing, and that's going to be the increasing the magnitude of the problem. Okay? The fact that the gap between the two is people who are living in cities but don't have an urban hukou. Okay? So for them, it's costly for children. All right. So now, okay. So how does it affect children? Schooling is compulsory. You have to send your children to school. So then parents have three choices. So one is that you can pay this fee called Zanjufe to enroll children in urban public schools. And these are, of the three choices, this is going to be the highest quality school, right? Or in some cases, this is not very common, but in some cities, they have special migrant schools serving the children of migrants only. And they're generally going to be lower quality than urban public schools. But the third option that a lot of people exercise is that they could just leave their children behind in the poor rural areas where they can go to school without the fee, without that extra Zanjufe fee. But school quality is much lower there, right? Now, the first fact is that this fee, Zanjufe, is quite large, right? So it's about 10% of the average migrant's earnings per child, okay? And the second fact that I'm going to make use of is that it goes up as the child gets older. So elementary school, it's about 1,400 renminbi, and then it goes up to like 2,200 yuan in middle school, okay? And in both cases, it doubles your educational expenditures. So basically, the fee is as large as the sum of all other expenditures parents report on children. Okay. And then, so that's another problem is that, I mentioned that there was a 2014 policy, right? So, so basically all of the city governments got this decree that basically encouraged them to try and control populations, right? And something I'll use for identification is that the decree was only applied to what they call mega cities, which has a very precise definition. If your city had more than 5 million people in your central district, that's called a mega city, and the policy applies there, right? And since then, those mega cities have also, they've reacted in a variety of ways, including shutting down migrant schools, right? So in Beijing, for example, lots of migrant schools got shut down, which means that suddenly it becomes even more costly for parents to keep their children with them. Yeah. Cities make the decision, right? The center is just giving guidance. Okay, so just a couple of simple facts about quality. So if you just look at the descriptive data on quality of urban versus rural schools, there are pretty clear differences, right? So the teachers in urban public schools are much better qualified, right, in terms of having greater degrees, and there's also official designations for those teachers, right? Going up from there all the way to here, a special grade, and urban public school teachers are just more experienced, much likely to be higher quality. Okay, so one cost of leaving your child behind is that your child gets lower quality schooling, but you can avoid paying the Zanjufe as a result of that. That's the trade-off. Okay, and so we are going to, as I said, I'm coming to this project to try and understand the effects of placing migration restrictions on people and whether that has effects on people's lives, right? So we're going to try and codify that. So there is the hukou policy. So we go through, we go through and create an index, but it's based on other published papers in the social sciences on that actually does the hard work that we didn't have to do of giving a lot of details on exactly what the hukou restrictions are, right? So because there are, more or less stringent restrictions on purchasing real estate, on access to healthcare, access to schooling, etc. So you can create you can code all of that. I'm not going to go through the details of that because it's mostly other people's work. And also you can also code up how difficult it is to get an urban hookup, right? So for example, there is literally a point system. So if you have a PhD, you get a certain number of points, master's a certain number of points. If you're uneducated, you don't get those points. And you have to get a threshold number of points before you can qualify for an urban hookup. So you take all of that and we create a composite index, which we call the hookup index, which just measures the overall difficulty of accessing that city services. So these are just some examples of highly hookah restricted cities versus less hookah restricted cities. All right, so, and this hookah index that we create, I put that on the x-axis, right? It's positively correlated with the share of migrants who choose to leave their children behind. It's actually also positively correlated with the fee that I was talking about, which varies across urban public schools, right? So more restricted cities generally have higher fees, and that's partly its definition, right? That's how the hookah index gets created. And you see this, I'm just showing you, before going into proper identification, I'm just showing you some basic descriptive stats in the data. So this is parents' decision to leave their children behind from the largest nationally representative survey of migrants in China. So what you see, there are two things that you see here. So here I've put the above median hookah index, so restrictive cities, and below median. Okay. The first thing you see is that so this migrant survey, we actually know destinations. Okay. So the migrants who are attached to more restrictive cities, they are more likely to leave their children behind than migrants who travel to less restrictive cities. And the second thing, comparing all the red to the green button, you see that when the child enters junior middle school, rather than primary school, you become more likely to send the child behind. As I said earlier, 1,400 RMB is the fee for elementary and 2,200 for the junior middle school, right? And there's a precise age at which you have to send your child to, so by September 1st of a given year, if you turn 13, that's when you have to go to junior middle school. And then the fee rises continuously. Exactly at that age, right? So all of these, I'm already hinting at how we're going to identify these things. We're going to look at hookah restrictiveness or not. We're going to look at the child's age and discontinuity around the threshold of that 13-year-old age, because we have access to the birth dates of the children, so before after September 1st, right? We are also going to be able to look at not the hookah index of the city you chose, but the hookah environment around you. So you're from a particular rural area. One nice thing about having the hookah system is that it tells us exactly where you're from, because I know the hookah that you hold, right? And so we can figure out how restrictive is our hookah in nearby cities, right? And then we can also look at gender. Right? So those are the types of things that we see. All right, so in the absence of a model, here's just a general type of argument we'll look at and now connect it to gender. So the outcome for children, right, the educational outcome or their outcome in adulthood is going to be a function of the investments of parental time, investments of money, school quality, the neighborhood environment, etc. Okay? And so migrant parents have to make this choice of whether to separate from children. And there are some costs and benefits. And some costs are, of course, family separation. It's presumably not nice to be away from your children. And that could lead to worse later life outcomes. But then the benefits are that it could lower school fees, and it could also actually allow the migrant parents to send back more in remittances. And the reason is it's more expensive to have your kid in the city with you, right? Perhaps if you send them back, you save more, you send more money back. Okay. And so it's not, by the way, so it's not immediately clear whether sending your child back is separating from your child is necessarily bad for the child, because it will depend partly on how important is parental time versus money, right? If remittances actually respond. Okay. And so when parents are deciding whether to leave their child behind, it's going to they might also think about, okay, maybe it's like what might matter is the returns to education versus the return to money, the remittance, right? And the return to spending time with the child, or the long run economic return to growing up in the city, what's the cost of city education? They consider all of this, right? And the point of the paper is that these considerations might vary by gender of the child. Okay? And so you might have parents making a different decision for their son versus their daughters. For example, like some theories would be, if the returns to being in the city is larger for boys than girls, that would be the case. Turns out that's not true. If the return to education is different for boys versus girls, that might be true, right? But the other thing that might be going on, given a lot of literature in China, is that if there are pre-existing son bias preferences, right? And then you're adding this, you're overlaying this additional cost on migrant parents, right? Then the cost may get borne disproportionately by girls, because this the fact that you're imposing this cost and making them separate from their children, right, may just exacerbate the fact that there's already a pre-existing son bias. Right? So the way that we'll proceed with the paper is that first we will look at some facts. So the facts are, okay, can we identify whether parents make systematically different choices with respect to their sons versus daughters? Okay? Given the all of the identification and the variation that I think. Okay? The first is, do parents treat sons and daughters differently? Second, we're going to look at, if they do, does it actually matter? Okay? So do children do better or worse when they're separated from their parents? Okay? So, and then finally, once we establish those two things, the answer is going to be yes, parents do treat their sons versus daughters differently, right? And it does matter. Being away from your parents, growing up without your parents is not a good thing, because we can track some children into adulthood with panel data. Okay, it's not a good thing. And then finally, the question is, okay, so then why are parents doing this? Why are daughters bearing the cost disproportionately? Okay. So it could be just rational economic reasons like this. We're going to try and rule some of those out, right? And try and look at the implications of son bias preference. So do we have any evidence that this is happening because of son bias preference? So the last part of the paper will try and unpack the mechanisms. Why is it that daughters are being treated more poorly than sons are? Yeah.
So most of the cases, both parents are migrant.
Yes. Yeah. In most of China, when, and I'll show you those results and how it breaks down, but you'd see about 75% of cases, parents are growing up with, children are growing up without either parent present when they're separated. Okay, so here's the outline for what we'll do. So we'll first look at whether parents are more likely to separate from daughters than sons, exactly when it becomes more expensive for you to keep your child with you. Okay? So for that, we'll have a triple difference design, looking at the hukou policy restrictions, variation hukou policy, variation in this enrollment age above versus below, middle school age versus elementary school age, and we'll do a discontinuity right around that age, right? And by gender, that's the third difference. Okay? And second, one of the concerns with that approach will be that maybe parents choose migration destinations carefully, depending on their preferences for variation in their preferences for staying with their children or not, right? You might worry that, okay, parents who really care about children's education, right? They may choose to migrate to cities that have lower hukou restrictions. So there are two ways we're going to deal with that. So one is, rather than looking at the actual hukou choice, we're going to look at the hukou environment in nearby cities, right? And that is also sufficient to identify, the effect is powerful such that just looking at variation in nearby cities without even thinking about where the migrant chose to go, you get this result. And the second, and the other way we're going to handle it, which is the second sub-bullet point there, is that it's using variation in this policy, because the policy was implemented for mega cities, which has this precise definition of 5 million people. We can look at cities just above and just below that threshold to see whether migrant families who had already made their destination choice, when this policy went into effect that made it even more costly, are they more likely to now send their daughters back rather than their sons? right? And you see the same effect there too. Okay. So for all these different types of identification, we get a very clear result that daughters are more likely to be separated than sons are. Okay. Second, then we're going to ask that, okay, so now daughters are being sent back. Maybe parents compensate them by sending back more in remittances. Right? So we can go to the migrant survey data where we have remittance information, right? And we have families with both daughters and sons, and we'll check that. Right? Answer is no. Third, we'll look at, okay, is this actually bad for kids? Right? So that's where we'll move to a different data set, which was a panel survey of children born in Gansu province in the early 2000s, and we can track them till they're about 30 years old. Right? And we look at later on in life, right? How do you do if you grew up without your parents relative to if you grew up with your parents? And here, again, when I'm looking at how do you do when you grow up with or without your parents, like that's happening because the parents are making a migration choice, right? And that choice is migration decisions are, as we all know, or is endogenous, it's selected, right? So the way we're going to try and identify that is the way that trade researchers in the US have studied the effect of what they call the China shock, which is China's entry into the WTO, led to, like huge manufacturing sector, like employment decreases in the US. That's led to things like deaths of despair. A lot of that work done here in this campus. Right? So we're going to just look at similar, that same shock, but its effect on the China side, right? Which is that when there's an import demand shock, right? So tariffs went down in certain product categories, right? And so some cities are more affected by those tariff changes. So that creates what we call a shift share instrument, right? To look at parents who are living, who have a rural hukou that's close to cities that had a larger tariff change and a bigger import demand shock. Those parents are going to be more likely to leave, right? And what happens to those? And what's nice about it is that even though we have data only from one province, this is Gansu province in central China, which is very large and very wide, right? So one part of Gansu are actually very close to cities like Xi'an, right? But parts of Gansu are bordering Xinjiang province, right? So you have big variation in even within one province, you have big variation in people's access to these export sector jobs. All right, I'll come back to this later. We have other ones. Okay, and then finally, all right, so there are three different literatures we're connected to. So one is, and I'm not, just in the interest of time, I'm not naming papers, but there's a literature on left behind children in China. And what we add to that literature is that we're documenting these longer run outcomes in adulthood. And the second thing we're adding is looking at these gender effects, right? Like whether sons and daughters are treated differently. There is, of course, another very large literature on various sources of gender inequality, not only in China, right? Is it discrimination? Is it there's a lot of different things people have studied, and we're just actually adding another potential source of gender inequality, and that is migration restrictions and imposing cost on parents, which can exacerbate gender inequality if parents already have some pre-existing preference. And that can happen even though the policy actually has no explicit gender component in its intent or its design. Okay? Hukou policy has nothing to do with gender, but daughters are bearing the cost of it. Okay? And the literature that I actually work most in is this literature on migration and spatial productivity gaps. So where in this literature, we've been studying, okay, why don't people migrate, right? Or what are the effects, why do we have such large gaps in productivity across space within the same country, right? Can we get developing countries to grow if we could just spatially reallocate people from poor, unproductive places to more productive cities, right? So that's the kind of thing I normally work on. And here we're adding like a gender dimension to the distributional consequences of these frictions that prevent mobility. All right, so I'm going to start with the population census of China, that data, but then we'll move to the migrant dynamic survey, which is a representative sample of a large sample of migrants. We'll use this panel survey from Gansu, done in Gansu. This was started by people who are at HKUST and UPenn. And then we'll have all these other sources of data for insurance and so forth. Okay, so here's the first result. So what I'm going to start with is a bit more of a complicated model, and then I'll simplify it. Okay. So here's what I mean by a bit more complicated model. There's actually 3 different choices one has to think about, right? It's not just leaving your child behind, right? Parents also have to first, there are two different decisions. One is, should I migrate or not? And second, should I migrate with my children or not? Right? So those are decisions that are being made simultaneously. Right? So that's why we start with the multinomial logit model, where we have all 3 choices covered. Now, when I move to the migrant survey, where I have a lot more detail, right? There you might have to worry about, and I'll worry about, like if I observe migrants behaving differently with respect to sons and daughters, it could be that the migration choice itself was selected, right? Parents of sons and daughters may have differentially selected the migration or not, which is why I'm starting with this. Okay? So less detailed data, but I think they're like that. And so the identification here is going to be this triple difference that I mentioned, which is I can do the regression discontinuity around the middle school enrollment age because the price of schooling goes up, right? Exactly at 13. So that's one difference. A second difference is going to be the restrictiveness of the hukou policy. And here, you might worry about people's choices of where to go. So therefore, we're going to look at an inverse distance weighted hukou index in surrounding areas. So basically, the restrictiveness of cities that are very close to you will get higher weight there. Right? So not the destination you actually chose, but which actually in the census cannot be observed anyway, but the nearby destinations that are more likely to have been chosen. And then the third difference is going to be the gender of the child, right? Male or female. Right. So what you get is so then because it's a multinomial logit with 3 choices, so I'm showing you 2 sets of coefficients. This is for girls. So the first, the omitted category here is the entire family is in the destination. Okay. And so the first column is whether or not you stay in the rural area rather than migrate. Okay. And the second column is whether you send your child back or not. That's what's that's a comparison in the second column. And what you see is for girls, so this is not marginal effects yet, this is just multinomial logit coefficient. For girls, you see that exactly when the girl goes above the middle school enrollment age, right? In places that are close to more restrictive cities, right? That's when there is a discontinuous jump in the propensity to separate from your daughters, and you don't see that effect for boys. The jump for girls, not for boys, and then you get that effect in the triple interaction. Okay. And so how does this translate into probabilities? Okay. So you'll get the effect exactly for girls, right? For that particular cell of your above enrollment age, nearby hukou restricted cities. So what this is telling us, this coefficient is telling us, is that if there's a 1 standard deviation increase in the restrictiveness of hukou policies in nearby cities, then there's an extra 1.4 percentage point jump in the parents' propensity to leave their daughter behind. Okay. Exactly when she crosses the threshold for middle school. When it gets costlier, there's an extra jump in the propensity to leave your daughter behind, and you don't see that jump for son. Okay. And how big is the 1.4 percentage points? Okay. So it's so when you look at elementary school kids, about 6% of them are separated from parents. So there's an extra 23% jump for girls, exactly when it becomes costly, but you don't see that jump for boys. Yep. So that will be, of course, there's many other objects or numbers, magnitudes that are interesting here, like how often do parents separate from boys or girls, etc. But I'm just focusing on the one bit of it, that extra jump, that can be well identified, right, based on the age changes. Okay. All right. So now the other, this question has already come up, which is one parent like separating from the kid versus both parents. So we can study that too in the census data. So now we have 4 choices, so I'll have 3 sets of coefficients. So I take the separation choice and divide that up into Because we can observe this whether one parent migrates or both parents migrate. Okay? And what you get is the effect is actually more of the effect is coming from both parents being away. About 70% of the effects come from there. And again, going to marginal effects, right? You're seeing, this is the net, the 1.4 is the sum of these two. Okay. 8 out of the 1.4, 0.8 out of 1.4 is with both parents away, and 0.5 of the 1.4 is with one parent. Okay. All right, so now that's what you use with the census data, multinomial logit models, etc. Now I'm going to try to make the case that there is more to learn from running linear models using the detailed migrant survey data there, right? The one is that, it's multinomial logit is a non-linear model. Fixed effects are a little weird. I'm not getting into the econometrics, but like there's easier interpretation for fixed effect and linear models, right? And we can control for a bunch of fixed effects that can address number of different concerns you might have about approval policy being correlated with other things that are happening in the city. Okay. And also concerns about one-child policy, and I'll come back to this in more detail later, right? That triple difference that I'm using is more easily interpretable in a linear model, right? And then the other important thing is that the migrant survey data has a lot more detail than the census doesn't, right? So for example, I can study remittance behavior of parents, because if the daughter is being sent behind, maybe she just gets more money, in which case it might be okay, right? And then the other problem is that we were using the 2010 census that we had access to, but with more data with the migrant survey, we can also look at this other policy I was talking about, where I can hold constant people's decision to migrate, and then look at when it becomes stricter suddenly, how do parents react? Right. And I was talking about an RD with a linear model. I can just actually show you what the results look like. Okay. So that's why I'm going to do that. So, but before I jump into that, I have to ask the question, like, is there some selection into migration by child age and gender? So there was no apparent selection in the earlier multinomial logit models, right? But we can look at that directly. And the answer is no. Decision on whether or where to migrate is not really affected by your child gender, okay? So why would that be? Like, why is that not affecting things if parents truly care so differently about their boys and girls? It's because the rural, or I think, sorry, I shouldn't say because, I think it's because wage gaps are so large in rural versus urban areas, right? So that's not a margin that parents are changing their decision on the basis of child data, right? But the margin they're changing is whether to keep a son or daughter when it becomes possible. Okay? So then, I feel like safely I can move on to now talk about conditional on migration, the decision to separate from children.
Correct me if my understanding is wrong, but mostly these are one-child households.
Yeah, it's going to be a mix because the one-child policy it does not actually apply equally to everybody, especially not to rural.
How should I think of the selective abortion?
Yeah, so we'll worry about that. So what I'll end up doing is so with selective abortion, so first of all, gender of the child may be endogenous. But and the second thing is so we actually have a lot of details on exactly when that happens. So what we now know is that the selective abortion result from Doug Allman's work, right? It's when the first child is a daughter, right? That's when for the second birth order and above, that's when you see the gender of the child that's actually born departing from biological, not for the first child, right? So what we can do is re-estimate all of our models with just second birth order and above. Okay? And I can show you those results. So that's one way to deal with that. But then you might then worry that, okay, there's a policy reason to also worry about this, which is that China allows departures from strict one-child control if your first child is a daughter, precisely to address the problem, right? The government reacts by saying, okay, if you have a daughter, then don't worry, you can have another, right? So then you might worry that the gender of the first child is going to be correlated with family size, which correlates with access to resources, which changes, right? So then what I can do is look at put in fixed effect for family size, right? And only do comparison between the one-child families, between two-child families who have a son and a daughter. And I can also use it for identification because to understand whether or not there's really something, it's really something about pre-existing son bias preferences, right? We can look at how do these effects change when I have a brother versus when I don't, versus when I have a sister.
Just to advocate specific, there is no gender bias when I look at just the first child.
First child, exactly. Yeah. In terms of select, I mean, gender bias in other forms, but not in terms of birth rates.
Yeah, that's good.
So in fact, that was the way that Doug Allman and co-authors had identified like that we think that there is selective abortion because of the pattern of biological. Yeah. All right, so now what I'm doing is just to get back to where we were, like establishing that the migration decision isn't affected by gender, right? Basically, we're gonna move on to thinking about for the set of select migrants, are they behaving differently with respect to their sons and daughters? Okay. So then we can, I want to replicate the result I already showed you in the multinomial Logit, right? But in a much more straightforward linear model, where again, we're just going to look at the decision to leave a child behind as a function of how costly it is to keep the child in the city, right? And that interaction of a huco-restrictive place times my child is now just entered middle school age rather than is 12 years old and it's still in elementary school. So that's going to identify that. Okay. All right, so when we do that, here's what you end up seeing in the diff and diff. So there's going to be a pair of RD graphs here. So the pair is, first I'm going to start with highly huco-restrictive cities, the above median, right? And next I'm going to show you below median. So above median, this is what you see, you know, that extra jump we were talking about, is that exactly when it becomes more expensive to keep my child in the city, that's when there's a jump in the propensity to send her back, but not the similar jump in the propensity to send him back. Okay, so that's the discontinuity, and that discontinuity does not exist in less huco-restricted cities, where it's easier for me to get an organ. Okay. And so this is just a regression version of it. Here you see the jump is about 3.5 percentage points. The extra jump when the girl becomes middle school age is 3.5 percentage points, and no such jump for boys. Okay. And so it's also significant in the triple interaction with gender. And then the other benefit of linear model with RD is that I can do a whole bunch of different specification checks, like, you know, what's the RD bandwidth, what's the, how do I treat the running variable, should I model that as quadratic or not, etc. And this result is really not dependent on those types of specification choices.
Maybe I'm not thinking right, but will you not get more variation if you just use the gender of the first child? It's just the gender effect. That you're focusing on a lot more local variation, and obviously it works to understand about that. It's very convincing, but why not just use the gender of the firstborn child if it's just random and just compare?
Yeah, you could do that, and I'll show you those results. Yeah, it's just that I mean we just lose a lot of data, that's all. But you could, but the result looks exactly the same when you look at just firstborn children.
Mechanisms, in how much child labor is that the boys stay in the city to work in the city because
Yeah. Right. So I'll come back towards the end on mechanisms, and I'll show you that it turns out that's unlikely to be what's going on. Okay? But we'll come back and discuss it. Okay, and I've already showed you most of the effect is coming from being left behind without the parent present, right? Now, since we have a migrant sample, you might also worry that, oh, look, maybe when it becomes restrictive, the person leaves the sample altogether because they just go back home, right? They're no longer in the migrant survey. So we can check for that. It doesn't look like there's any discontinuities in like the density of the distribution of parents, right? So that's fine. Okay, so here's maybe one of these. I already talked through this. I'm wondering if I should click it. Okay. So essentially, okay, how do we? I just talked through it with Atis, right? So if you limit sample to firstborn children, Atif, if you wanted to see this, let's show you. This is the Atis slide. Okay, So you see pretty much exactly the same effect. Instead of 3.5, it's just 3.6 percentage points, right? For when you just look at firstborn children. Okay? And then you have so you have a
I actually wanted another one as well.
okay. Ask and you shall receive.
So it's, why not just look at firstborn gender and just compare those households and like you don't need to do anything else if I'm understanding correctly, because on average everybody is exposed to this friction,
Okay.
and given the son preference, all you need is whether my firstborn is a girl or a boy, and if it ends up being a girl, then for all the reasons you mentioned,
Yeah.
I'm being more intensively treated.
Yeah,
That
but
actually gives you a much wider science correctly. That will
sure,
help
except
you,
that
right?
yeah, except that yeah, I mean it'll help me in that dimension in that I don't have to control for a lot more things. But on the other hand, the Foucault policy environment does matter. So if I really want to, so the title of the paper is Migration Restrictions Are Creating Gender Inequality. So I'm trying to link those two concepts. Right? If I don't look at variation and migration restrictions, it's hard to make that case, right?
Could you finish up in 5 minutes?
Okay, sure. So, okay, so then in that case, let's just, so one child policy causes complications. We've thought carefully about it, right? The results don't seem to be related to that. And then, as I already pointed out, the urban, the megacity policy would be another way to think about the effect. So let me jump to the results and explain what it is I'm identifying. So we're looking at a set of parents who had made their migration destination choice before 2014. Okay, 2014, this new policy comes up, and the policy is applied to megacities, but not to non-megacities. Above 5 million, not below 5 million, right? So what we see is that if you're in a city, if you're in a megacity where the policy applies, right, and your child and past 2014 when the policy applies, right? That's when you're more likely to send a middle school age girl back home, right? And the effect here is actually even larger. When you use this variation, it's a 7 percentage point rather than a 3.5 percentage point. Okay? And so that, like the reason we did this is that it addresses concerns about selection of cities to migrate to. Conditional, it's conditional on the destination you've already chosen. If I turn the screws even more, you react by sending your daughter away. Yeah, you do. Okay, so then second thing is that maybe you can compensate daughters by sending remittances back. Turns out it's the exact opposite. Okay, so parents of daughters send 10% less back in remittances, right, than parents of sons. And in fact, this gets even bigger exactly during junior middle school age. Right. So this is exactly, the move from here to here is exactly when more girls are being sent back, and the gender difference in the remittance sent back is moving in the opposite direction. Okay. So girls are getting less time from parents and they're getting less money from their parents. That's what's going on. Okay. All right. So now to look at the long-term consequences. Okay, so we have this panel survey. So we have kids who were around middle school age in 2000, and we also observed them in 2015. Okay? So they're about 30 years old when I'm looking at them. So I'm gonna have a really simple regression, which is let's look at their later life outcomes when they're adults. Are they poor? Do they have an urban home for themselves? Are they educated? How many years of education do they complete? Right? As a function of whether they grew up with or without their parents when they were young. Okay? Now, here, because this is a survey of rural families, the variation here is different. The variation here is the children are in the rural area, either the parents with them or the parent is away, right? So it's a migration decision. So I need to instrument for a migration decision here, which is why I use that, the WTO entry and world import dimension. Okay. So just skipping over the details, shift share instrument. So the standard way to do it is like how exposed are you to the shock. Okay. And what you find is, let me just jump to the result, is the effects are pretty large. Okay? So the kids who grow up without their parents complete fewer years of education, or about 27% less education. They are 41 percentage points less likely to pass the high school entrance exam, right? And this is a remarkable effect because when you ask parents, like, why do they send their children back? Often, anecdotally, the answer they give is that so that they can go prepare for the high school exam, which you take in the province, right, where you have a hukum. Yeah? But it's the exact opposite. They're sending girls back and then when they get sent back, they're much less likely to pass that exam. Okay? And a bunch of health outcomes. So you see that in adulthood, they are 35% more likely to be classified as poor. Okay. And there's some in this particular Gansu survey, they collected some psychological data as well. So these kids have worse mental health in a variety of dimensions, right? And also worse physical health. The kids who grew up without their parents are 10% more likely to be obese. Yeah? And all of these, the other thing is that all of these results are also likely to be underestimates. Okay? And the reason is they're underestimates compared to the first part of the data. Right? There are several reasons. So one is that instrument that I use, right? The import demand shock. Okay? So that instrument generally actually makes life better, right? For migrant parents. Like if there are other mechanisms by which these kids should be better off, it's because like there's a nice import demand shock and there's more employment opportunities available. So maybe the kid will have better employment opportunities later in life, but we're seeing that they're actually doing worse. And you might also think that parents who make a connection to the city that just grew, right? That should be good for the kid otherwise, right? And in spite of that, you're seeing these kids are doing worse. And the second important reason is that this is kids who are separated from parents, migrant parents, and I'm comparing them to rural kids, not urban kids, right? And even relative to rural kids growing up in rural areas, they're worse off, right? Whereas most of the results I showed you in the first part of the paper, right, was being sent back when you're and not growing up in the city, right? And growing up in the city generally is much better for later life outcomes. Yeah. Okay, let me actually just because I'm out of time, I'm gonna just tell you about the mechanism and in 1 minute. Okay. So what we find is that this effect that I just pointed out, which is an extra jump in the probability that children get left behind, daughters get left behind, it's much worse when that girl has a male sibling. Those are the families that tend to send their daughters back. If you don't have a male sibling, you don't see that much of an effect. Okay? So that suggests that there is some kind of a gender preference that's driving this. Okay? And we can also study because of this, the male bias sex ratios that varies across provinces. We have province level variation where some places it's much worse, where lots of girls are being selectively aborted. In those types of provinces, the effect is much bigger. Okay? So you see daughters being left behind in province, when the parents come from provinces that we know from other data is worse for girls. Okay? And then the other possible explanations, that the returns to education are higher for boys. It's actually the opposite. Right? It's not a surprise. We know from a lot of other research that given comparative advantage in brawn versus brain tasks, right? Girls actually have higher returns to education compared to boys. That's true. So that can explain things. Girls also have a higher return to being in a city and migrating compared to like their delta, their increase is actually better. So that can't explain it either, right? And also, you might also think, oh, maybe it's because parents have a social norm that boys have to take care of parents. That doesn't explain it either. Okay. All right, thank you. I'll just leave it.